The first crack in my 85-inch television screen sounded like a gunshot, and I knew right then that my weekend had just turned into a war zone where the enemy wore sticky fingers and carried plastic hammers. That single moment, watching $300 worth of destruction happen in slow motion while my girlfriend's sister smiled like this was perfectly normal behavior, told me everything I needed to know about the battle lines being drawn in my own home. What I didn't know yet was that this was just the opening salvo in a conflict that would end with changed locks, police reports, and my girlfriend learning the hardest lesson of her life about mistaking patience for weakness. My name is Jake Harper, and at 31 years old, I've built something most people spend their whole lives chasing. After 6 years in the Marine Corps, I came back to Austin with enough discipline to turn a construction job into a career, enough savings to buy my own place, and enough self-respect to know that my space is sacred. The townhouse I bought in the new development off South Congress isn't just property. It's proof that hard work pays off when you keep your head down and your standards high. 3 levels of steel and glass, minimalist furniture that costs more than it looks, and every surface clean enough to perform surgery on. This is what control looks like, what peace feels like, and I guard it the way I was trained to guard anything valuable. When Emily moved in 18 months ago, I thought I was making room for partnership. She was 28, worked in marketing for some tech startup downtown, and had this infectious energy that made my structured life feel less like a military barracks and more like an actual home. Her clothes started appearing in my closet, her ridiculous collection of throw pillows invaded my couch, and her habit of leaving coffee cups on every flat surface drove me crazy in a way that felt almost charming at first. I figured this was what compromise looked like, what adults did when they built something together. Turns out I was watching the early stages of an invasion and calling it romance. The problems started small, the way cancer starts with one bad cell. Emily would mention her sister Sarah needing help with the kids, and I'd nod along because family matters, right? Then the mentions became requests, and the requests became expectations, and somewhere along the line, I stopped being asked and started being told. Sarah lived out in San Marcos with 3 kids under 10 years old and a parenting philosophy that could generously be called chaotic and accurately be called negligent. Tyler was 8 and had the energy of a small tornado. Mason was 6 and treated every object like a potential projectile, and Lily was 4 and communicated primarily through ear-splitting shrieks that could shatter wine glasses. The first time they came to my place, I should have seen the disaster coming from a mile away. It was a Saturday morning in late September, and Emily had casually mentioned Sarah needed to drop the kids off for a few hours while she handled some emergency at work. I was skeptical, but Emily gave me that look, the one where her eyes got all soft and her voice dropped into that persuasive register that had worked on me too many times before. She talked about family, about being there for each other, about how much it would mean to Sarah to have someone reliable to count on. The speech was polished, practiced, and I fell for it because I wanted to believe that helping out once in a while was the kind of thing good partners did. Sarah showed up in a minivan that looked like it had survived multiple wars, with fast food wrappers visible through every window and suspicious stains on the upholstery. The kids poured out like a dam breaking, and within 30 seconds of entering my home, I watched my carefully maintained sanctuary transform into a disaster zone. Tyler grabbed the Xbox controller with hands covered in something orange and possibly toxic. Mason started using my coffee table as a trampoline, and Lily discovered that my floor-to-ceiling windows made excellent canvases for her sticky fingerprints. Sarah stood in my doorway, watching this destruction unfold, and when I looked at her with what must have been obvious horror, She just smiled and said something about kids needing to express themselves. Express themselves. That was the phrase she used while her son picked up a toy hammer from God knows where and swung it directly into my television screen. The sound was sickening, a sharp crack followed by a spider web of damage spreading across the display like frost on a windshield. I stood there, frozen, watching $3,000 of electronics die, while Sarah laughed nervously and said, "Boys will be boys." Like that explained anything. Emily rushed over, made apologetic noises, promised they'd be more careful, but I could see in her eyes that she expected me to just absorb this loss, to smile and nod and pretend my property didn't matter as much as her sister's convenience. That was the moment something shifted in me. I'd been trained to assess threats, to recognize when a perimeter was breached, and I suddenly understood that my home was under occupation by forces that had no respect for boundaries. The rest of that day was a blur of noise, mess, and mounting rage that I kept bottled behind a calm exterior. By the time Sarah picked up her kids 6 hours later, my walls were smudged with handprints, my kitchen looked like a food fight had occurred, and my patience was thinner than razor wire. Emily tried to smooth things over that evening, talking about accidents and family obligations, but I barely heard her. I was too busy calculating the cost of repair, replacement, and the price of my own compliance. The next few weeks followed a pattern that felt designed to break me down. Emily would announce that Sarah needed help, the kids would arrive like a biblical plague, and I would spend entire weekends watching my home get destroyed in increments. Every visit left new damage, new messes, new violations of my space. A scratch on my hardwood floor from dragged furniture, a mysterious stain on my leather couch, a crack in my bathroom mirror from some unsupervised game that apparently required projectiles. Sarah never apologized, never offered to pay for repairs, never even acknowledged that her children were causing thousands of dollars in damage. Instead, she'd show up, drop them off, and disappear for hours while I played unwilling babysitter in my own home. Emily's response to my growing frustration was to double down on emotional manipulation. She'd cry about how hard Sarah had it as a single mom, how much the kids needed positive male role models, how family was supposed to support each other through difficult times. Every complaint I raised was met with accusations that I was being selfish, immature, unwilling to sacrifice for the people she loved. The arguments got heated, her voice would climb into that register that made my teeth hurt, and somehow every conversation ended with me feeling like the bad guy for wanting my own space respected. I started to realize that Emily didn't see me as a partner, she saw me as a resource to be exploited, a wallet with legs that she could deploy for her family's benefit. The breaking point came on a Friday night in early November. I'd just finished a brutal week on a construction site, managing a crew building a high-rise downtown in weather that swung between scorching and stormy. My body ached, my mind was fried, and all I wanted was to collapse on my couch with a beer and silence. Instead, I came home to find Emily sitting at my kitchen counter with an expression I'd learned to dread, that particular combination of determination and fake sweetness that meant she was about to ask for something I didn't want to give. She didn't even let me get my boots off before launching into her speech. Sarah needed consistent help, the kids were getting attached to me, and Emily had decided, not asked but decided, that I would babysit every weekend going forward. Not once a month, not occasionally, but every single weekend. Friday night through Sunday afternoon, my home would become a daycare center for 3 untrained animals masquerading as children. She presented this as a done deal, as if my agreement was assumed, and when I stared at her in disbelief, she escalated immediately. Her voice got sharp, her words got pointed, and she delivered the ultimatum that would seal her fate. She said that a real man helps family, that my reluctance showed how immature and selfish I was, that if I couldn't commit to this, then maybe I wasn't ready for a serious relationship. The threat was clear: accept her terms or she'd leave, and she genuinely seemed to believe that I'd buckle under pressure because I had before. She stood there in my kitchen, in my home, demanding that I surrender my weekends, my peace, my entire life structure to accommodate her sister's chaos, and she expected me to say yes because the alternative was losing her. That was her mistake. That was the moment she confused my previous patience for permanent weakness, my occasional compromises for unconditional surrender. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the woman I'd been building a life with, but a stranger who'd been running a long con, slowly expanding her territory until she controlled everything. The television had been a test to see if I'd enforce boundaries, and when I failed that test, she'd gotten bolder. Now she was going for total victory, complete ownership of my time and space, and she thought the fear of being alone would make me comply. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt since my last deployment, that cold clarity that comes when you've identified the mission and stripped away all emotional noise. I looked her dead in the eyes and said no. Just that, just no, with no explanation or justification, because grown adults don't need to justify refusing unreasonable demands in their own homes. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, anger, and finally that calculated sadness that was supposed to make me feel guilty. She started crying, asking how I could be so cruel, threatening to leave, and when none of that moved me, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I sat there in the silence that followed, drinking my beer, and made a decision. This relationship was over, not because of one fight, but because the foundation was rotten. Emily had shown me who she really was, someone who valued her convenience over my boundaries, who saw manipulation as a valid negotiation tactic, who believed crying entitled her to whatever she wanted. I'd been in enough dangerous situations to know that hoping things would improve was how you got killed, and I wasn't going to spend the next decade being slowly consumed by someone else's chaos. Saturday morning started before dawn. I called a locksmith I'd used before when a contractor needed emergency access to a site, explained the situation, and paid extra for same-day service. While Emily was presumably at Sarah's house plotting her next move, I was systematically removing her from my life. The locksmith changed every lock, I updated all my security codes, and I pulled out the spare boxes I kept in my garage for exactly this kind of project. Her clothes went into boxes, her shoes, her bathroom products, her ridiculous decorative items that served no purpose except taking up space. I packed everything methodically, labeled each box with black marker, and stacked them in my garage like cargo awaiting shipment. The whole process took about 4 hours, and I treated it like any other construction job: efficient, thorough, no wasted motion. I wasn't angry anymore, I was just done. And there's a particular kind of peace that comes from taking decisive action after too long spent tolerating unacceptable conditions. By noon, my home looked like mine again: clean lines, empty surfaces, no trace of the invasion that had been slowly consuming my space. I updated my Ring camera settings, made sure every entrance was secure, and settled in to wait for the inevitable confrontation. It came sooner than expected. Around 2 that afternoon, I heard car doors slam outside and looked at my phone to see Sarah's minivan parked in my driveway. The camera showed Sarah, Emily, and all 3 kids approaching my door, and I could see the expectation on their faces. They thought this was business as usual, another weekend of me rolling over and letting my home get destroyed. I waited until they were on my porch, until Sarah had actually reached for the doorbell before I stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind me. The look on Sarah's face when she realized I wasn't letting them in was almost worth the previous months of harassment. Her expression shifted from entitled confidence to confused anger in about 2 seconds, and when she demanded to know what I thought I was doing, I explained in the same calm voice I'd used for hundreds of briefings. This was my private property. I hadn't invited anyone over, and they needed to leave. She tried to argue, tried to push past me with the kids as leverage, but I'd learned a long time ago that you don't move when you don't want to move, and my 200 pounds of former Marine wasn't budging for her theatrics. Emily started crying immediately, that same performance she'd used the night before, but this time I didn't even acknowledge it. I kept my eyes on Sarah, who was getting increasingly aggressive, shouting about family and obligations and what kind of man turns away children. The irony of her lecturing me about responsibility while trying to force her childcare duties onto someone else seemed completely lost on her. She grabbed at my arm, trying to physically move me, and that was her second mistake of the day. I took out my phone, dialed 911, and very calmly reported that someone was trespassing on my property and had just committed assault by putting hands on me. The change in Sarah's demeanor was instant. She stepped back, started babbling about misunderstandings and overreactions, but I just stayed on the line with dispatch, confirming my address, and yes, I wanted to press charges. Emily was begging now, saying we could work this out. This didn't need to involve police, but I wasn't interested in working anything out. These people had shown me who they were, and I was simply responding appropriately to aggressive trespassers who thought emotional manipulation gave them immunity from consequences. The police arrived in about 10 minutes, 2 patrol officers who'd probably responded to 1,000 domestic disputes and could spot the dynamics immediately. I showed them the ring footage of Sarah grabbing me, explained that I'd never given permission for this visit, and confirmed that yes, I wanted her banned from my property. Sarah tried to play the victim, talking about family disputes and how I was being unreasonable, but the officers weren't interested in the drama. The law was clear. This was my property. I had the right to refuse entry to anyone, and putting hands on me was assault, regardless of the emotional context. They issued Sarah a citation and warned her that any future contact could result in arrest for trespassing. Emily stood there crying, her makeup running down her face, looking at me like I was a monster for enforcing basic boundaries. I felt nothing except relief that the situation was being documented officially. The officers asked if I wanted to file a restraining order, and I said I'd think about it, which in reality meant I'd already decided yes, but wanted to consult my lawyer first. When they finally left, Sarah peeling out of my driveway while screaming obscenities, I went back inside and poured myself a bourbon. The next 24 hours were an exercise in information warfare. My phone exploded with messages from Emily's family, friends, random people I'd never met who apparently had strong opinions about my character. Every message followed the same script. I was cruel, heartless, destroying a good woman over nothing, refusing to help family in need. The subtext was always the same. I should have sacrificed my peace, my property, my entire life to make Emily's family's problems easier. Nobody mentioned the destroyed television, the damaged walls, the complete disrespect for my space. In their narrative, I was the villain for wanting my own home to remain mine. I handled it the way I handled any incoming fire. I shut it down systematically. Every number I didn't recognize got blocked. Every social media message got deleted without reading, and I called my lawyer to start the restraining order paperwork. Emily tried calling from different numbers, leaving voicemails that cycled between apologetic and accusatory, but I never picked up. There was nothing left to discuss. She'd made her choice when she issued that ultimatum, and I'd made mine when I changed the locks. Sunday afternoon brought the final act. Emily showed up with Sarah to collect her belongings, and I had everything ready on my driveway, stacked neatly in boxes with her name labeled clearly. I'd even included items I'd bought for her, clothes, jewelry, whatever, because I didn't want a single thing in my home that connected me to this disaster. They loaded the boxes in silence while I stood in my doorway, and when Emily tried one last time to talk, to explain, to negotiate, I cut her off with 5 words. "Your key doesn't work anymore." That was it. That was all the closure she was getting, and when she realized I meant it, when she understood there was no emotional appeal that would change my mind, something broke in her. She started screaming, calling me every name she could think of, and Sarah had to physically pull her back to the car. I watched them drive away, Emily's face pressed against the window, still shouting silent words, and felt absolutely nothing except satisfaction that my property was secure again. The fallout took a few weeks to fully materialize, but it was spectacular. Emily's car, which had been registered through my construction company's fleet insurance for the discount, got repossessed when I canceled the policy. Turns out she'd been telling people it was her car, even though the title was in my company's name and I'd been covering the payments as a convenience. Without transportation and without a free place to live, she had no choice but to move in with Sarah, the same chaotic disaster she'd been trying to export to my weekends. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the living situation was exactly as horrible as you'd expect. 2 adults who both thought they were in charge, 3 kids destroying everything, constant fights about money and space and whose fault this whole situation was. But the real twist came when I learned that Emily's family blamed her for losing me. See, they'd seen me as a stable paycheck, a resource they could tap whenever they needed something, and Emily's failed manipulation had cost them access to my money and my time. Her own mother apparently told her she'd been stupid to push too hard, to demand too much, and now nobody in the family would help her because she'd burned the golden goose. The woman who'd cried about family values was discovering that her family's values were entirely transactional, and she'd just destroyed her end of the transaction. I occasionally got updates, always unsolicited, about how bad things were going for her. She'd had to take a lower-paying job closer to Sarah's place. She was fighting with her sister constantly. She'd gained weight from stress and eating garbage food. Her entire life had imploded. Meanwhile, I was thriving. I'd gotten a promotion at work, managing bigger projects with bigger budgets. I'd replaced my television with an even better model and had the walls professionally repainted to erase every trace of those kids. I'd started dating again, casually, making it very clear up front that my space was mine, and anyone who couldn't respect that could walk. The legal resolution came about 6 weeks after that Sunday confrontation. I got the restraining order against Sarah without much difficulty. The assault charge was documented, and she'd made enough threats through text messages that the judge had no problem granting it. Emily tried to contest it, arguing they were being punished for a family disagreement, but the evidence was overwhelming. Property damage, trespassing, assault, and a pattern of boundary violations that I'd documented meticulously. The judge didn't care about their sob story, he cared about the law. And the law said I had every right to protect my property from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. There was a moment during one of those court proceedings when Emily caught my eye across the room. She looked tired, older somehow, like the last 2 months had aged her 5 years. She mouthed something, might have been, "I'm sorry," or might have been, "I hate you," but I didn't care enough to figure out which. She was a problem I'd solved, a threat I'd neutralized, and whatever she felt about the outcome was her problem to manage. I'd learned a long time ago that you can't save people from themselves, and Emily had chosen her path when she decided manipulation was an acceptable strategy. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I ran into one of Emily's friends at a coffee shop downtown. She approached me nervously, like I might bite, and said she wanted to apologize for some of the messages she'd sent. Turns out Emily had been spinning a very different version of events, painting me as controlling and abusive, and only when the truth came out through mutual friends did people realize she'd been lying. This friend told me that Emily had apparently tried the same pattern with a new boyfriend, making demands and issuing ultimatums, and he'd kicked her out within 3 weeks. Emily was learning, very slowly and very painfully, that the world didn't revolve around her needs, and that crying wasn't a valid substitute for reasonable behavior. 6 months after I changed those locks, I'm sitting on my terrace watching the Austin skyline light up as the sun sets behind the hills. The air is hot, thick with that particular Texas humidity that makes everything feel alive and intense. On the table next to me are contracts for the biggest project of my career, a mixed-use development that'll take 2 years and make my reputation in the industry. My home is exactly as I like it, clean, ordered, peaceful, mine. No sticky fingerprints on my windows, no toys scattered across my floor, no emotional blackmail disguised as relationship discussions. I learned something valuable from that whole disaster, something they don't teach you in the Marines but probably should. Kindness isn't weakness, but allowing people to mistake your kindness for permission to exploit you absolutely is. Emily thought she could wear me down through persistence, that my desire to be a good partner meant surrendering my boundaries completely. She gambled that I valued the relationship more than I valued my self-respect, and she lost that bet spectacularly. The look on her face when she realized I'd rather be alone than be used still gives me satisfaction when I think about it. People ask sometimes if I regret how it ended, if I think I should have tried harder to make it work. The answer is simple. You don't negotiate with people who view negotiation as a weakness to exploit. You don't compromise with people who see compromise as surrender. And you definitely don't build a life with someone who thinks your property, your time, your entire existence should be available for their convenience. Emily didn't want a partner. She wanted a servant with benefits, and the moment I stopped playing that role, she tried to punish me by leaving. The joke was on her because I'd already decided she was gone. I just let her think it was her choice. The best revenge isn't some elaborate scheme or dramatic confrontation. It's living well, living on your own terms, with boundaries that don't bend for tears or threats or emotional manipulation. Every morning I wake up in my quiet home, make my coffee in my clean kitchen, and start my day without someone demanding I sacrifice my peace for their chaos. That's victory. That's what winning looks like. Not the anger or the legal battles or the satisfaction of watching karma work, but the simple, profound peace of knowing that my life belongs to me and nobody else gets a vote. Sarah's kids are probably still destroying someone's property. Emily's probably still trying to find a man who'll tolerate her manipulation tactics, and somewhere out there, someone else is learning the same lesson I taught them. You can demand all you want, cry all you want, threaten all you want, but at the end of the day, a man who knows his worth doesn't negotiate with terrorists, even when they're wearing yoga pants and claiming to represent family values. I built this life brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, and nobody gets to tear it down because they've confused access with entitlement. The lights of Austin spread out below me like a promise of everything that's possible when you refuse to settle for less than you deserve. Somewhere in this city, there's probably another guy getting the same ultimatum Emily gave me, being told to choose between his peace and someone else's problems. I hope he makes the same choice I did. I hope he understands that the sound of a door closing and locking behind someone who doesn't respect you is one of the sweetest sounds you'll ever hear. And I hope he knows, like I know, that being alone is infinitely better than being used. I finish my bourbon, check the locks one more time out of habit, and head inside. Tomorrow brings another day of building something worth protecting, and I sleep better knowing that the only people with keys to my kingdom are the ones who've earned the right to be here. Emily wanted access without earning it, demanded entry without showing respect, and learned the hardest way possible that some doors, once closed, don't open again, no matter how hard you knock. That's the story. That's how a woman who thought she held all the cards discovered she was playing against someone who was perfectly happy to flip the table and walk away. And every night when I lock my door and settle into the silence of my perfectly maintained home, I know I made exactly the right choice. Power isn't about enduring pain, it's about refusing to let anyone inflict it in the first place. And the strongest thing a man can do is look at someone trying to destroy his peace and say, with absolute finality, "Not here, not anymore, not ever again."